The Road That Hunts the Quiet by Lyshyn. Part 1. The Road That Shouldn't Exist. Elena Ward had learned to trust roads the way some people trusted prayers, not because they always worked, but because the alternative was admitting you were surrounded by things you couldn't control. She was 32, small-boned and deliberate in her movements, the kind of person who packed bandages and a headlamp before she packed snacks. It wasn't paranoia. It was history. There had been a time, years ago, in a different life, when her job depended on seeing danger before it announced itself. Now, she sold risk management software to companies that liked their disasters predictable. She kept her hair tied back, her nails trimmed, her voice calm on the phone. People mistook her calm for softness. Tonight, calm was just a thin blanket pulled over a cold truth. She was late, and the mountain didn't care. Her windshield wipers ticked in a steady rhythm, sweeping away nothing. The sky was clear enough for stars to glare down like watchful eyes. The forest rose on either side of the two-lane road, dark and dense. The tree lines stitched together so tightly it looked less like nature and more like a wall pretending to be alive. She had driven this route dozens of times, out of Briar Glen, past the old quarry, over Blackridge Pass, down into the valley where her sister lived with her new baby, and a house full of bright, safe noises. Familiar roads were supposed to lower your guard. That was the trick of them. They lulled you into thinking you could afford to think about other things. The message she hadn't answered, the argument she'd had with her sister last month, the dream that had woken her up 3 nights in a row, her own name being called from somewhere far away. Her phone's GPS displayed a blue line, confident and uncomplicated. Then came the fork. It wasn't new. She told herself that immediately. It couldn't be new. She would have remembered a fork this sharp, this sudden. The road split like a snapped bone, one branch curving right in a wide, familiar arc, the other diving left into a darker cut between the trees. The left lane wasn't marked on her screen. Her GPS didn't even hesitate. It showed her still on the main road, as if the fork didn't exist. Elena eased off the gas, her headlights washed over a weathered post at the split. No sign, no reflective paint, just raw wood, slick with age, like it had been licked clean by years of rain. A small bundle hung from it, tied with twine, something pale and knotted, turning gently in the air. A charm, she thought, a warning, or a joke. She leaned forward, squinting, and in that second of distraction, her tires drifted just enough to commit her to the left branch. The detour accepted her without sound. There should have been some feeling of decision, like a click, a shift, a sense of direction chosen. Instead, it felt like a door closing behind her with no slam at all. She glanced at her rearview mirror. The fork was already gone, swallowed by darkness and distance, like it had never been there. "Elena," she said out loud, sharp and practical, as if speaking her own name could anchor her. "You missed the turn. That's it. Turn around." She tapped the GPS. The screen zoomed, recalculated, then displayed her car icon floating on an empty grid. No roads, no blue line. Just her, drifting in a pale digital nowhere. A laugh rose in her throat and died there. She wasn't the kind of person who laughed when she was uneasy. Unease was useful. She checked the dashboard clock, 10:41 p.m. The radio cut in and out, offering static and brief, distant voices as if it were overhearing other stations from other towns. Elena turned it off. Silence felt safer than random words. That was when the snow began. At first it looked like ash, pale flecks drifting into her headlights. Elena blinked, confused. The temperature gauge on the dash had been steady all evening. The air was cold, but not that cold. Snow this late in the season made no sense. Then the flakes thickened, and the world changed. Snow altered sound the way heavy curtains altered light. Within minutes, the tires' hiss on asphalt softened. The engine's hum felt too loud inside the car and too quiet outside it. The trees became shapes behind a white veil, and the road ahead narrowed into a tunnel of headlights and falling silence. Elena slowed to a crawl. Her breath fogged the windshield faintly. She could taste the metallic tang of her own anxiety, that penny-on-the-ton sensation that came when her body decided it wanted to survive more than it wanted to be polite. There's a weather system, she told herself. Microclimate, it happens. But her phone displayed a clear moon icon and the words, no precipitation. As if to mock her, the snow fell harder. A mile later, or what felt like a mile, because distance on a mountain at night was as unreliable as memory, her tires slipped. It wasn't a normal skid. Elena had driven in sleet, ice, rainstorms that swallowed the road. This was different. The steering wheel went light in her hands as if the car had unhooked itself from the earth. The tires lost traction on what looked like dry asphalt dusted with snow. For a heartbeat, the car moved sideways, a silent slide. The forest tilted in her headlights. Her stomach dropped, cold and hollow. She corrected gently. No jerking, no panic. She let the car find its balance. It straightened, and then the road did something else. Something that made her hands go cold on the wheel. The lane markings, faded yellow lines, seemed to recede from her, as if the road was subtly widening, not by stretching outward but by withdrawing, like a living thing pulling away from touch. Elena's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror again. The road behind her looked narrower than it should. The snow seemed thicker there, more opaque, turning her past into a blank white wall. She drove on because stopping felt like giving the mountain time to decide what she was. The warning sign appeared on a bend. Her headlights caught it at the last second. A plank of wood nailed to a tree trunk at shoulder height. The wood was split, the letters carved deep and crude. No paint, just raw cuts that stood out pale against the dark grain. Turn back while you can still remember why. Elena's foot went to the brake, instinct screaming, but she forced herself not to slam it. She rolled past slowly, reading it again as if repetition could make it logical. Someone's messing with people, she said aloud. Some local, some idiot. Yet the letters weren't fresh. The cuts were old, weathered, softened at the edges as if the tree had tried to heal around them. She felt a sudden, irrational urge to turn her head and look directly into the forest. She didn't. That was one of her rules. Another life's rule. You didn't give the dark your eyes unless you had to. Looking could be a kind of invitation. The engine sputtered, just once, like a cough from deep in the car's throat. Elena frowned and checked the gauges. Fuel was fine. Temperature normal. Battery light off. The engine coughed again. Then the dashboard lit up in a brief, frantic bloom. Icons and warnings blinking in a strobing chorus. For a moment, it looked like the car was trying to speak in symbols. Check engine, traction control, battery, each one flaring like a distress signal. And then everything went black. Not the headlights, not immediately. Those stayed on for 2 more seconds, casting bright cones of light into the falling snow. And then they died too, as if someone had reached down and pinched the world's wick. Elena's hands tightened around the wheel. In the sudden darkness, her heart sounded enormous, a heavy, living drum. She tried the ignition. Nothing, not even the weak click of a struggling starter. She tried again, slower, like patience could persuade machinery. Nothing. Outside, the snow fell in total silence. No wind, no distant howl, no creak of branches. Even the forest, vast and crowded, seemed to have stopped making noise. Elena sat very still, listening. Her breathing sounded wrong in the small cabin of the car, too sharp, too alive, as if the air had grown thin and her lungs were dragging it in with effort. She rolled down the window an inch. Cold air slid in, smooth as water, and with it came a smell that didn't belong to winter. Iron, not the clean tang of cold metal, not the faint scent of brake dust. This was warm iron, like blood on a handrail, like a penny held too long between damp fingers. Her stomach tightened. A memory brushed her mind, something red and bright, a hallway light buzzing, her own hands shaking as she tried to keep pressure on a wound she didn't want to look at. The memory had no edges. It was just sensation. Elena rolled the window back up and forced herself to focus on what mattered. She grabbed her phone. No signal. The screen brightness seemed too harsh, the only artificial light in a world that had decided to turn itself off. She turned on the flashlight function and aimed it out the windshield. Snowflakes spun in the beam like moths. That was when she saw the footprints. They crossed the road from right to left, clear impressions in the thin layer of snow. The tread pattern looked like hiking boots, deep, angular, purposeful. The footprints moved steadily across the lane and then stopped. Not at the edge of the road, not where a person would step into the forest. They stopped in the middle of the asphalt, as if whoever made them had simply vanished. No scuff marks, no turn, no stumble, just absence. Elena's skin prickled. Her mind offered explanations because that's what it did when fear tried to take over. Maybe the wind had filled them in. Maybe an animal had disturbed them. Maybe, but there was no wind. She got out of the car anyway. The door opened with a soft click that sounded too loud in the hush. Cold wrapped her immediately, creeping down her collar, slipping into her sleeves. Snow landed on her hair, melting into damp pinpricks. Her boots crunched faintly as she stepped onto the road. The silence out here wasn't just a lack of noise. It felt intentional, like the mountain was holding its breath to hear her better. She walked to the footprints, crouched, and shone her phone's light into the impressions. The edges were crisp, fresh. Whoever had crossed had done so recently. And then the smell of iron grew stronger, enough to taste. Elena stood slowly. The forest on the left side of the road was a tight wall of trunks and shadow. Her flashlight beam cut into it, revealing snow clinging to bark branches like black fingers. Between two trees, far back where the light weakened, something shifted. Not a branch in the wind, a tall shape. It moved without stepping, sliding from one patch of darkness to another as if distance meant nothing to it. The movement was too smooth, too certain. Elena froze. Her body knew the difference between an animal and something pretending to be one. Her skin tightened over her bones. Her pulse sped, but her mind went cool and sharp. She angled her light toward the shape. The beam reached only partway as it traveled through falling snow. For an instant, it caught something pale. Maybe bark, maybe fabric, maybe a face too far away to confirm. And then the shape was gone. Elena swallowed. The sound felt loud inside her own skull. She turned back toward her car. The road behind her looked wrong. Not dramatically. Not in a way she could point to and prove. But the darkness where the bend should have been seemed closer than before. As if the road had shortened while she wasn't looking. She walked quickly, boots crunching. The car's silhouette loomed like a small, helpless animal. She climbed in, slammed the door, and sat for a moment, one hand on the steering wheel, the other gripping the phone. She stared at the windshield. The snow made the world beyond it blurry and anonymous, like a face seen through frosted glass. Her mind returned to the sign. Turn back while you can still remember why. Why you came. Why you're here. Why you thought any of this was normal. Elena tried the ignition one more time, not because she expected it to work, but because giving up on it felt like admitting something she wasn't ready to name. Nothing. She exhaled slowly, forcing her breathing into a controlled rhythm. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Like training, like discipline. And then she noticed something else. The GPS screen, dark now, flickered briefly, then lit up without her touching it. The map was still empty, but a single line appeared, faint and gray, stretching behind her. It wasn't a route, it was a boundary. As her car icon shifted slightly, just the natural drift of satellite recalibration, the line shifted too, as if adjusting itself to keep her inside a specific shape. A cold thought formed, clean and unmistakable. The road didn't exist on the map because it didn't exist unless she was on it. Elena looked at the snow beyond the windshield and imagined herself stepping off the asphalt, walking into the trees, leaving the road behind. Would the road still be there if she tried to come back? Or would she return to where it should be and find only forest, only white silence? Only the memory of pavement? Her phone light trembled in her hand. She steadied it. Staying in the car felt like waiting for a decision to be made about her. Leaving felt like making one herself. She reached into the glove compartment and pulled out what she always carried without thinking. A compact first aid kit. A small utility knife, a thermal blanket folded like a secret. She shoved them into her backpack. She grabbed the headlamp from the center console and strapped it around her forehead. Her reflection in the dark windshield looked pale and unfamiliar. Eyes too bright, mouth set too tight. "I'm not lost," she whispered, though she wasn't sure who she was talking to. "I'm not." A sound interrupted her. Not a roar, not a scream. A soft, deliberate scrape, like something heavy being dragged across stone, coming from somewhere beyond the reach of her headlights. Elena's breath caught. The scrape stopped. Then from the forest, a single exhale, low, patient, as if something out there had been waiting for her to choose. Elena turned off her phone's flashlight to preserve the battery. Darkness flooded the car again, thick and immediate. She opened the door. Cold rushed in like a living thing. She stepped out, her boots sinking slightly into the thin snow. She didn't look back at the car for long, because already it felt less real, like an object from a different world left behind on the wrong side of a door. Her headlamp clicked on, throwing a narrow beam into the trees. The forest waited, quiet and close. Elena tightened the straps of her backpack, adjusted the light, and took her first step off the road, because staying felt worse. Because something about that silence suggested the mountain liked obedience. And Elena Ward had survived long enough to know. The things that like obedience rarely want to keep you safe. Part 2. The Man Who Hunts the Quiet. The trees swallowed Elena the way deep water swallowed light, slowly at first, then all at once. Snow fell through the branches in lazy spirals, landing on needles, bark, and her shoulders. Her headlamp beam made each flake look like a tiny moth searching for warmth. The forest floor was uneven and littered with old leaves beneath the fresh dusting, the kind of ground that turned ankles without warning. Elena moved carefully, placing each step like a decision. Behind her, the road faded into nothing. Not darkness. Nothing. A seam closed where the asphalt had been, as if the world stitched itself shut. She did not turn around again. She kept her eyes on what her light could touch. The beam slid over trunks and low branches and slick stones. She tried to find logic in the layout, drainage, slope, a path animals might use, but the forest did not behave like a forest. It behaved like a room someone rearranged when she wasn't looking. Her breath came out white. She counted steps in her head to keep panic from deciding her pace. At step 42, she saw the first charm. It hung from a branch at eye level, swaying with a movement that didn't match any wind. A string of bones threaded on twine, small, cleaned vertebrae, then a larger piece that might have been a knuckle. At the bottom dangled a watch. Not a cheap watch. A solid one. Metal band, face scratched but intact. The hands were frozen at 10:41. Elena's stomach tightened. She reached up, not touching it, only bringing her light closer. More hung behind it. Antlers, teeth, a child's bracelet made of plastic beads, a keychain shaped like a cartoon rabbit. They formed a line through the trees, like breadcrumbs laid by someone who didn't want to be forgotten. Offerings, her mind suggested. Or trophies. She moved on, faster now but controlled, not letting her breathing get loud. Snow creaked faintly under her boots. Then she heard it. Breathing. Not hers. It came from behind her, just beyond the edge of her headlamp's spill. A slow inhale, a slow exhale, measured and calm, and it matched her pace. When she slowed, it slowed. When she took 2 quicker steps to test it, it followed. Still slow, still steady, like a metronome locked to her spine. Elena stopped. The breathing stopped. She held her breath. Silence. A trick of her own lungs? The snow? The forest settling? No. She knew what her mind sounded like when it lied to her. This was too deliberate. Elena turned her head slowly, letting her lamp swing in a smooth arc. The beam swept over trunks, branches, drifting snow. Nothing. She rotated farther until she faced the direction she'd come from. Nothing. But the iron smell was stronger now, warm and close, as if someone had opened a door to a room where something had recently bled. Elena's fingers tightened around the strap of her backpack. She forced her shoulders down, forced her jaw to unclench. Panic was not an emotion, she reminded herself. Panic was a mistake. The next sound was not breathing. It was scraping. A heavy, dragging scrape that vibrated through the ground more than it traveled through air. It was the sound of something being pulled across stone, stopping, then pulled again. Elena's headlamp beam caught movement, a large shadow shifting between 2 thick trunks. Then, briefly, The figure stepped into the open space between trees. He was bigger than she expected. Not tall in a stretched, lanky way. Broad, heavy, built like a man who had carried burdens long enough for his bones to adapt. He wore layers that blurred into the darkness, a coat or cloak of thick fabric, stiff with age. His head was covered, hood, mask, something that swallowed his face. Nothing about him reflected light. In one hand he dragged something that made the scraping sound. A length of metal? A hook? A tool? Elena couldn't see clearly, but she felt the weight of it in the way his arm moved like a crane arm, slow and certain. The figure did not look around the way a person searched. He looked directly at her, not at her face, at the center of her. Like he knew where she was before the light found him. Elena's heart tried to sprint, but she caught it. She did not run. Running made noise. Running made decisions for you. She took one step back, careful, her boot pressing into snow without crunching too hard. The man did not move closer. He waited. The forest seemed to wait with him. Elena shifted her gaze to his hands, to the tool dragging behind him. The object caught a sliver of light and flashed dull gray, metal with edges, not a blade exactly, but something meant to catch, to hold, to tear. Her mind offered images she refused to accept. She kept her thoughts narrow and practical. Distance, direction, cover. She pivoted slowly to her left, choosing a line between two dense thickets where branches would block sight. She moved without speed, without suddenness, as if she was simply walking away from an unpleasant conversation. The scrape resumed behind her. Not faster, not closer, just present. He didn't chase. That was the wrongness of it. Predators chased, even people who hunted liked the pleasure of pursuit. This one did not. He behaved like someone who knew her exhaustion was inevitable, like someone watching a clock, confident time would do the work. Elena's headlamp beam caught another line of charms as she moved. More watches, more bones. Some antlers were cracked clean in half. Several pieces hung lower than the rest, as if weighted down by something unseen. Her boot caught on a root, and she stumbled half a step. The forest reacted. It was subtle, but she felt it. A tightening, like the space between trees had narrowed, like the ground had become slightly less forgiving. Then the snare tightened around her ankle. It was so quick, she didn't understand what happened at first. One moment, her foot was moving forward. The next, it was yanked backward with a sharp, vicious pull that slammed her down onto her knee. Pain burst bright and hot along her shin. Elena bit down on a cry before it could become sound. The wire was thin, almost invisible against snow and leaf litter. It cinched tight, expertly placed. Not the rough rope traps amateurs set. This was precise, intentional, and it had not been there a second ago. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She reached down, fingers numb in the cold, and felt the cable biting into her boot and the bone beneath. A memory surfaced, not a picture, but a posture. Hands moving fast, knife at the right angle. Don't tug. Don't fight the trap. Let the mechanism show you where it wants to go. Survival is a language, she thought, and my body still speaks it. Elena pulled her utility knife from her pocket with a controlled motion. The blade was small but sharp. She found the cable and followed it to where it disappeared into a spring mechanism anchored to a buried stake. Her hands did not shake. Not because she wasn't afraid, because she had been afraid before, and she had learned fear could be used like fuel if you poured it carefully. She slid the knife under the cable and sawed slowly, silently. The cable resisted, then gave. The sudden release would have snapped her leg if she had been standing. As it was, it jerked her foot, and she absorbed it with her hands, keeping herself from slipping into panic. For a moment she stayed crouched, breathing through her nose, counting again. Not steps this time, beats. 1, 2, 3. She lifted her head. The forest in front of her was empty. But the breathing resumed behind her, closer than before, calm, patient. Elena did not turn fully. She angled her headlamp beam just enough to catch the edge of movement. The massive figure stood between trees, still at a distance that felt measured rather than accidental. Waiting. He attacked only when she panicked. The trap hadn't been about catching her. It had been about testing her. About listening to what kind of noise she made when pain grabbed her. Elena forced herself to become quiet inside. She let her muscles loosen fractionally, let the frantic electricity drain from her limbs. She lowered her shoulders. She made herself small in emotion, not in posture. The breathing stopped. The scrape stopped. For 2 seconds, the forest felt ordinary, cold, snowy, haunted only by her own fear. Then she looked again, and the figure was gone. Not retreated, not hidden behind a trunk. Gone, as if he had never been there at all. Stillness makes him disappear, she realized. Panic makes him real. She stood slowly, testing her ankle. Pain flared, but the joint held. She could walk. She could keep moving. She chose a direction that felt like downhill. Mountains had gravity. Gravity was honest. The trees thinned slightly after several minutes. Time warped in the quiet, stretching and snapping back. Elena began to see shapes that weren't trunks. A line too straight, a corner too sharp. A cabin emerged from the snow like an old thought. It was small, built from dark logs, roof thick with white. Smoke rose faintly from a chimney. Smoke. Warmth. A human sign. Elena stopped at the tree line, scanning. Her headlamp beam touched the cabin's door, the small window, the porch. On the porch sat a pair of boots. Fresh boots, brown leather, clean, placed neatly side by side as if someone had stepped out of them and walked barefoot into the snow. Her first instinct screamed trap. Her second instinct, older, quieter, said shelter. She approached with her knife in hand. The snow around the porch was undisturbed. No footprints leading away, no tracks circling. She climbed the steps. The wood did not creak, as if it had been oiled recently. The door was not locked. Elena pushed it open with the tip of her boot. Warm air spilled out. Not just warm, lived-in warm. The smell of burning wood, faintly sweet, and underneath it something like soap. Her headlamp beam swung inside and caught a cast-iron stove glowing softly. A kettle sat on top, humming with gentle heat. Someone had been here moments ago. Elena stepped in and let the door swing mostly shut behind her without latching. She didn't want to trap herself in a box. The cabin was one room, a cot with a folded blanket, a table with 2 chairs, hooks on the wall holding coats, and disturbingly more charms, bones and watches arranged almost politely like decorations. On the far wall was a map board, not a random map, hand-drawn pages pinned and overlapped, creating a patchwork of the mountain. Elena stepped closer, her breath slowing. The map showed the road, it showed the fork, it showed the place her car had died, marked with a small black dot, and it showed her path through the trees, not guessed, not generalized, marked, with dates, little notations in tight handwriting, 10:41, arrival, 47, off-road, 10:53, first stop, 11:02, snare. Elena's skin went cold under the warmth. There were other routes marked too, older ones. Some crossed out, some circled, some ended abruptly. On the lower right corner of the board were names written in a column. Most had been scratched through. At the bottom, unmarked, was hers. Elena Ward. The writing looked older than tonight. Her pulse thudded once, hard. A sound came from behind her, not scraping this time, not breathing. A soft shift of weight, wood faintly complaining. Elena turned. The cabin's window was dark, but she could see her own headlamp reflection in it, and behind that reflection, something else. A shape standing in the corner of the room where the light didn't reach, not moving. Watching. Elena's throat tightened. She raised her knife, not as a threat, more as an anchor to reality. Her headlamp beam swung toward the corner. The light fell on empty air. But she felt him there, not as a body, as a tension. The cabin wasn't meant to protect her. It was meant to teach her something. The warmth, the boots, the maps, none of it was kindness. It was preparation. It was a stage set for her to step into. Elena backed away from the map board, keeping her eyes on shadows, on corners, on any place a shape could become a man. The stove crackled softly, like laughter kept low. Then, from somewhere inside the cabin, so close it felt like it came from within her own ribcage, she heard breathing again, slowed, matching her pace exactly as she took one careful step backward. Elena stopped, the breathing stopped. She understood the rule now in her bones. This hunter didn't hunt bodies, he hunted noise. And the mountain, this road, this forest, this cabin had been built to listen. Elena reached for the door latch without looking away from the shadows. Her fingers closed around cold metal. Behind her, something scraped once, softly, like a warning whispered in a language older than words. Elena froze, and in that stillness she felt the hunter's presence sharpen, as if the quiet itself had teeth. Part 3. The Forest That Keeps Score. Elena kept her hand on the latch until her knuckles went pale. But she didn't open the door. Not yet, because the cabin's warmth was a lie that felt too well rehearsed. It was the kind of warmth offered by something that wanted you to forget what cold could do. The stove crackled softly, and the kettle's faint hum sounded almost domestic, like a lullaby in a room that had never known sleep. She stood very still, headlamp fixed on the darkest corner where she had felt a presence. The light made the cabin's interior seem smaller, tighter. Shadows clung to the edges of objects like old stains. And there was that other sensation, worse than fear because it was quieter: recognition. The map board had her name on it, not written in the messy panic of someone improvising, written in tidy, practiced lines. Like a record. She swallowed, tasting iron. Elena turned her head slowly and looked back at the map board. Her route was marked with minute-by-minute detail. Her decisions, her hesitations, her stumble at the root. Even the snare's placement was noted, as if the forest itself had reported back. She reached up and touched her own name with 2 fingers, expecting the paper to feel damp or brittle or warm. It felt normal. That made it worse. She pulled her hand away and forced herself to scan for other details, anything that could become a weapon, a clue, a way out. On the table sat a notebook. The cover was dark leather, scuffed and soft. It looked handled often. Elena approached without haste, the way you approached a sleeping animal. She kept her body angled toward the door. If the hunter was inside the cabin, he would strike when she panicked. She could feel that truth in the air. So she moved as if panic was a foreign language she refused to speak. She opened the notebook. The first page contained a list of dates and times, not just tonight, years, decades. Names appeared beside each entry, followed by short notes in that same controlled handwriting. Ran, screamed, quiet until the end, learned quickly, returned. Elena flipped deeper and saw sketches. Rough maps of trees and bends, marked with symbols that looked like instructions more than drawings. A word repeated often. Underlined. Continuity. She didn't understand it yet, but her skin did. The cabin, the map, the boots. This wasn't random cruelty. It was a system, a ritual, a machine disguised as a wilderness. A faint sound came from outside, snow sliding off a branch, soft as a sigh. Elena closed the notebook gently, as if it might hear. She stepped back to the door, opened it 2 inches, and let cold air wash in. The cold felt honest. She slipped out. The moment her boot touched snow, the cabin felt less real behind her. The warm air didn't chase her into the forest. It stayed inside like a trapped thing. Elena shut the door again without latching it. She didn't want to provoke the feeling of being sealed in. Then she turned her headlamp toward the trees and moved away. Within 10 steps, she realized the forest had already changed. The line of trees behind her looked different. Not dramatically, but enough to make her brain stutter. A trunk that had been split low to the ground now stood whole. A birch she remembered as pale and peeled was now darker, bark intact. The slope felt steeper, the spacing between branches tighter. Elena stopped, heart quietly accelerating. She turned back toward the cabin. It was still there, sort of, a shape through snow and branches, but the angles didn't match what she'd just left. The porch looked farther away. The window was in a slightly different place. Or perhaps her eyes were lying. She blinked hard, then looked away for a second, just long enough to adjust her grip on her backpack strap. When she looked back, the cabin was gone. Not hidden, not obscured. Gone. Elena stared at the space where it had been. Trees stood there now, thick and indifferent, snow dusting their branches. Her mouth went dry. The forest leaned closer, she thought, and she didn't mean it as poetry. She meant it like a measured fact, like walls tightening in a room. She took a slow breath and continued downhill, because the only thing worse than being hunted was being trapped with your own thoughts. After several minutes, time distorted again, stretched by silence, she began to notice the paths. They appeared as subtle differences in the snow. Slight depressions, bent twigs, places where leaves showed through, where someone else had stepped before. She followed them because humans made paths for reasons. The path led her between two close trunks and into a small clearing where the snow lay thinner, disturbed by something long before tonight. In the center of the clearing stood a pole made of stacked branches tied together like a crude totem. From it hung more charms. Bones, antlers, watches, and something else, strips of cloth as if torn from clothing. One strip had a pattern of small red flowers that made Elena's stomach twist. It looked like fabric from a child's jacket. Her headlamp moved over the pole and caught scratches in the wood. Lines carved carefully, one beneath another. Names, perhaps. She stepped closer. The first name she could read was Hollis Merrick. Beneath it was Sarah Penn. Beneath that, June Carter. Some names were scratched through, some weren't. At the bottom was an empty space, fresh wood, unmarked. Elena's throat tightened as a new understanding slid into place. These weren't random decorations. They were records, a scoreboard. The forest keeps score. Her headlamp beam dipped lower, and she saw what lay at the base of the pole. Not full bodies, nothing so simple. Remains scattered and arranged. A boot with the laces still tied. A belt buckle. A broken pair of glasses. Bones, cleaned, positioned with odd care. Like someone had taken the mess of death and organized it into meaning. Elena crouched, careful not to touch anything, and her light caught another detail. The bones were not all the same size. Some looked older, yellowed and worn smooth. Some were newer, pale and sharp-edged. Many stories, she thought. Not one. And then she saw something that made her skin go cold in a deeper way. A mask. Not one mask, several stacked near a tree like discarded skins. Rough leather, stitched at the edges. Some had antlers attached, some had holes cut where eyes would be. She stared at them, her mind resisting the obvious conclusion. The hunter is not alone. Or perhaps there had been many hunters across time, passing the role the way people pass down heirlooms, quietly, inevitably. A sudden flash hit her, so vivid she jerked back as if struck. She was running, not in her own body, in someone else's. Her legs were longer, heavier. Her breath was ragged and loud. Snow stung her cheeks. Trees whipped past, clawing at her clothes. Panic filled her chest like boiling water. Behind her, scraping, a heavy drag. She glanced over her shoulder and saw the figure, massive, masked, moving without hurry. Then pain, a sharp snap at her ankle. She fell, mouthful of snow, screaming. Elena blinked. She was back in her own body, crouched at the base of the totem, her hands trembling despite her effort. Her headlamp beam jittered over bones and cloth. She swallowed, fighting nausea. That wasn't imagination. It wasn't a normal memory. It felt like residue. Like the forest had recorded fear into its soil and air, and now it was playing it back through her nerves. Memories that aren't hers. Elena stood quickly, breathing hard despite herself. She forced her breathing to slow. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The iron smell thickened. The clearing seemed smaller than it had a moment ago. The trees looked closer. The shadows between trunks looked deeper, not because the light changed, but because the space changed. The road feeds on fear, she realized. Fear made the world tighter. Fear made distance collapse. Fear made the hunter more real. She pressed her lips together until they hurt, grounding herself in physical sensation. She focused on details. The exact shape of a branch, the angle of a rock, the pattern of snow on a root. The tightening eased slightly, as if the forest lost interest when she refused to provide it with panic. Elena backed away from the totem, and her headlamp beam caught something hanging lower than the others. A bone, long and smooth, carved with letters. She stepped closer, despite every instinct telling her not to. Her light landed on the carving. Elena Ward. The letters were deep, old, weathered by time. Not carved tonight. Not carved recently. Her name had been here long before she arrived. A cold emptiness opened in her chest. She had not stumbled into this by mistake. The fork in the road had not been an accident. The snow had not been weather. The trap had not been coincidence. The lie of randomness peeled away, and underneath it was something far worse: selection. She was chosen. Elena's mind tried to reject it. She began assembling reasons: someone from her past, a stalker, a cruel local game. But those explanations crumbled under the weight of the impossible details: the road that vanished, the cabin that rearranged itself, the memories bleeding through her like borrowed dreams. A sound in the trees made her freeze. Not scraping, not breathing, whispering. So faint she couldn't tell if it was wind or voices, but it carried a rhythm like words spoken with teeth clenched. Her headlamp swung toward the sound. Between two trunks, she saw another charm pole, farther away than it should have been, as if the forest had unfolded more space when she tried to look. The pole was older, heavier with offerings. Beneath it were more masks, more bones, more carved names. Elena's head swam, and another flash seized her. A man, young, terrified, hiding beneath a fallen log. He held his hand over his mouth to keep from sobbing. He could hear breathing outside, slow and patient. He peeked through the gap and saw boots in the snow. Not one pair, many. He saw several figures standing around, all wearing masks. They faced inward, as if listening to something beneath the ground. He did not scream. He stayed still, and one of the masked figures turned its head slightly, as if sensing his restraint. Then the young man felt something slide around his ankle. Elena staggered and grabbed a tree trunk, nails digging into bark. Her heart hammered. So it wasn't just one hunter, it was a circle, a tradition. The forest wasn't simply killing people, it was training them. Elena's eyes darted to the masks near the totem. A few looked newer than the rest, leather still supple. She understood in a sudden, sick clarity. Those who survived didn't leave cleanly. Survival left a mark, a hook in the mind, a pull. The road calls survivors back. Not because they wanted horror, because the road wanted continuity. Elena's breath came faster. The clearing tightened again, trees leaning inward as if drawn by her rising fear. She forced herself to stop moving. She locked her knees, steadied her shoulders, and let stillness settle over her like armor. The tightening slowed. From somewhere deeper in the forest, the scraping resumed, distant, patient, not rushing. Elena did not run. She walked, slow and deliberate, away from the totem. She chose a line that avoided obvious paths because paths were invitations. She kept her headlamp beam low, not to search for danger, but to watch her footing. Her ankle throbbed with each step, reminding her of the snare. Pain became instruction again. Move carefully, move quietly, don't let the forest hear you begging. After a long stretch of silence, she found another sign, not nailed to a tree this time, but carved into a flat stone half buried in snow. The letters were shallow, old. The hunter was prey first. Elena stared at it until her eyes burned. In her mind, the massive figure became something else for a moment. Not a monster, but a person who had been shaped into a role the way a river shaped stone. A man who had survived by learning to become what hunted, not evil. Unfinished. A sound behind her made her spine stiffen. Breathing again, close enough to feel. Elena stopped instantly. The breathing stopped. She stood with her back to the stone, headlamp pointed downward, refusing to give the forest the satisfaction of seeing panic on her face. In the silence that followed, she felt something like expectation. As if the mountain was listening for what she would do next. As if it didn't merely want her to die, it wanted her to understand. The forest needs continuity. It requires someone to carry the hunt forward. Elena's fingers tightened around her knife, and for the first time, another thought joined the fear. Thin, sharp, and dangerous. If this place was a system, systems had rules. And if rules existed, they could be learned. Somewhere out there, the man with no name waited for her to make noise. But Elena Ward, standing in the snow with her breath controlled and her mind settling into cold focus, began to suspect the most horrifying twist wasn't that she might die here. It was that the mountain didn't intend to let her. Not if she had the right kind of silence inside her. Not if she could be shaped into what it needed next. Part 4. The Truth Buried Under Survival. Elena walked until her ankle went numb, until the ache became a dull pulse that matched her heartbeat. She didn't know how long she'd been moving. In the forest, time didn't behave like time. It folded. It repeated. It paused when she paused, as if the mountain preferred to decide when minutes were allowed to exist. The snow thinned, not gradually but in patches, like someone had erased weather with an inattentive hand. The air remained cold, but the flakes slowed, then stopped entirely in the space of a few steps. Elena halted. No wind, no falling snow, no hush of white against branches. The sudden absence felt unnatural, like a mouth closing. She listened. At first she heard nothing, then beneath the silence she sensed a low vibration, faint but constant. It wasn't sound traveling through air, it was something in the ground. A pressure, a hum. The mountain's heartbeat, her mind offered, and she hated that her mind could make poetry from fear. Her headlamp beam found a narrow trail, a corridor between boulders where the trees gave way to rock. The passage looked older than the forest around it, as if the mountain had cracked open and never quite healed. She followed because she had no better truth to follow. The corridor led to a hollow, a shallow basin in the rock, sheltered from branches, open to the sky. In its center stood a single dead tree, bleached pale, trunk twisted as if it had grown while being pulled in opposite directions. Hanging from its branches were no charms this time. Only one thing, a mask. It was darker than the others she'd seen. The leather looked thick and worn, edges stitched with a careful hand. No antlers, no teeth, just a blank face with narrow eye holes. Beneath the mask, carved into the dead tree's trunk, was a symbol Elena recognized without knowing where she'd learned it. A circle broken by a single vertical line, like a road cut through an old seal. Her breath tightened. The missing memory began as a smell. Not iron. Something else, faint and sickly sweet. Smoke on clothing, the scent of burned plastic, of overheated metal. A sound followed, distant but sharp, her own voice screaming. Elena blinked. The world lurched. For a heartbeat, she was no longer in the hollow. She was in a car, not this car, but a car, older dashboard, different smell. Her hands were on the wheel, white-knuckled. Snow fell hard against the windshield. A shape moved in the headlights. Too tall, too still. She slammed the brakes. The car skidded. A sign flashed past, "Turn back while you can still remember why." She didn't turn back. Something struck the side of the car with a heavy thud. Metal screamed. Glass fractured. Elena's throat burned with a cry that wasn't hers but came from her mouth. The car spun. The world became lights and snow and the violent scream of twisting steel. Then, impact. A terrible final stillness. Elena felt the moment her body stopped working. Not pain, not even fear. Just a sudden, bewildered quiet, as if she had been removed from her own life. Elena gasped and stumbled back in the hollow, nearly falling. Her headlamp beam swung wildly, catching rock and sky and the dead tree. She pressed her palm against her chest as if she could hold her heart in place. "I died," she whispered. The words sounded wrong in her voice. Too flat, too factual. "I died here." Her mind searched for denial, for reason, for any alternative explanation. But memory didn't feel like imagination. It had weight. It left bruises. Elena stared at the mask hanging from the dead tree, and recognition settled in her bones like cold water. This wasn't her first time being chosen. It was simply the first time she remembered. A soft scrape sounded at the edge of the hollow. Elena's body tensed, but she forced herself not to jump, not to turn too fast. Panic would tighten the world. Panic would invite the mountain to teach her again. She turned slowly. He stood at the mouth of the corridor, framed by rock. The man with no name. He looked closer than before. Not because he had moved faster, but because the mountain had decided distance was no longer necessary. His coat hung heavy on his broad shoulders, damp at the hem. In his hand, that dragging tool scraped lightly against stone, an unhurried reminder that he could make noise whenever he wished. His face was still hidden beneath a hood and mask. Elena held her knife low, not raised in challenge. A knife was not power here. Stillness was. She did not run, she did not speak. The man watched her, motionless. For several seconds, nothing happened. The hollow seemed to hold its breath. Then Elena took one careful step backward, positioning herself near the dead tree and the hanging mask, because she understood now that this place, this hollow, was not random. It was an altar. The man moved one step forward, not rushing, not lunging, teaching. Elena's ankle throbbed. Her breath wanted to speed up. She forced it down, counted beats again. 1, 2, 3. The man took another step. The corridor behind him looked narrower than it should, as if the rock itself was leaning inward to seal off retreat. Elena felt the mountain's patience like pressure on her skin. It doesn't kill quickly, she thought. It teaches. And a lesson requires time. She shifted her weight and tested the space around her. The hollow was a trap. Rock walls on 3 sides, corridor on the 4th. No trees to weave through, no uneven ground to use. He had cornered her. The scrape stopped. The man stood less than 10 feet away now, close enough that Elena could see details. The stitching on his gloves, the wear on the leather of his boots, the faint white crust of dried snow at his coat seams. He tilted his head slightly, as if listening. Elena realized with a cold clarity that he was not listening for her footsteps. He was listening for her mind to crack. He waited. The mountain waited. Elena forced herself to do something that felt impossible. She softened her gaze. She let her focus widen. She stopped searching for escape routes and instead watched the man like she would watch a wild animal that might be hurt as much as dangerous. She saw it then. The way his shoulders sagged, barely, like a burden carried too long. The way he held the scraping tool, not like a weapon he loved, but like a duty he couldn't set down. The man took one last step, and then he did something Elena did not expect. He knelt. One knee pressed into snowless stone. His head bowed slightly, not in submission, but in something that looked like completion. Like a ritual performed at the end of a long, exhausting road. Elena's breath caught anyway, because kneeling was not predator behavior. Kneeling was human. The man lifted his hands to his face and unfastened his mask. The leather came away with a soft sound, like skin unsticking from skin. Elena stared. His face was not monstrous. That was the worst part, because part of her had wanted monstrosity. Monsters were easier to hate, easier to run from. He was older than she'd expected. Late 50s, maybe more. Weathered skin, carved by cold and time. A scar ran from his temple down toward his jaw, pale and thick. His eyes were tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. But there was relief there, too. Not joy. Relief. Like a man who had finally reached the end of a sentence he'd been forced to speak for years. His lips parted, and for a moment, Elena thought he might talk. Instead, he looked past her, toward the dead tree, toward the hanging mask, then back to her, as if asking a question without words. Elena's hands tightened around her knife. Her mind screamed at her to strike, to fight, to end him while he was kneeling. But she sensed, deeply, that violence here would not free her. It would only feed the mountain another kind of fear. The man raised one hand and pointed, slowly, toward the mask on the dead tree. Then he pressed his palm to his own chest. A gesture of offering, a gesture of passing. Elena's throat went dry. Survival isn't escape, she realized. Survival is inheritance. All those names carved into bone, all those routes marked on walls, all those watches frozen at 10:41. They weren't only memorials, they were records of transfer. The mountain didn't want corpses. It wanted continuity. The man on his knee was not simply a hunter. He was a keeper, and he was tired. Elena looked at the mask hanging from the dead tree. A memory stirred, not the crash this time, but something quieter. Standing in this same hollow, hearing scraping, feeling cold, watching a kneeling figure, and hearing words spoken in a voice she hadn't recognized then. It doesn't stop unless someone holds it. Elena's mouth opened. Her voice came out rough. What is this place? The man's eyes lifted, and for the first time Elena saw something like gratitude. He spoke, and his voice was quiet, so quiet it barely disturbed the air. A road, he said, as if the word carried more meaning than any sentence. That remembers hunger, he swallowed, then added, a mountain that learned people are loud. Elena frowned, confusion tightening in her brow. Why me? The man's gaze flicked to her face, then to her hands, to her posture, as if reading her the way the forest read footsteps. Because you can be quiet, he said, even when you're afraid. Elena felt anger flare, sharp and sudden. I didn't choose this. The man's expression tightened, not defensive but sorrowful. "No one does," he said. "Not the first time." He looked down at the stone beneath his knee, then up again. "The choice is always given," he said, "but it is never kind." Elena's headlamp light trembled slightly as her hand shook. She steadied it with her other hand, grounding herself. "What choice?" The man gestured to the corridor behind him, the only exit. "Leave," he said softly, "and the road opens for someone else. It will call them. It will find them. It will teach them." His jaw clenched on the last word, as if it hurt. Then he gestured to the mask. "Stay," he said, "and you hold it closed. You take the noise. You keep the hunger here where it belongs." Elena stared at him. "And if I don't?" The man's eyes hardened, not with threat, but with inevitability. "The forest does not allow vacancies," he said. As if on cue, the hollow's air thickened. The corridor behind him seemed to narrow further, rock drawing closer like teeth. Elena felt the mountain's patience shift into pressure again, like a teacher waiting for a student to answer. Her gaze went to the dead tree, to the mask. It looked suddenly familiar, not as an object she'd seen before, but as something that had always been waiting for her. Elena stepped toward it without fully deciding to. Her body moved ahead of her thoughts, guided by the dark logic of remembered dreams. She reached up. Her fingers touched the leather. It was warmer than it should have been in the cold air. Not stove warm. Body warm. She lifted it off the branch. The inside of the mask smelled faintly of smoke and iron and something else, like wool dried near a fire. It smelled like endurance. Elena turned it in her hands. The stitching was precise, almost tender. She raised it toward her face. The man watched without moving, his breath shallow, as if afraid to disturb her choice. Elena hesitated at the last inch. Her mind screamed images, her sister's house, the baby's soft head, the life she had built with careful, normal choices. "If I stay," she whispered, voice tight, "what happens to me?" The man's eyes softened again, and in them Elena saw the shape of a long loneliness. "You become the road's answer," he said. "You become the quiet." Elena's hands trembled. Then she felt something beneath that trembling, recognition again, deeper this time. A sense that she had been walking toward this moment for years without knowing why. That the pull she'd felt in dreams, the strange calling in quiet places, it hadn't been madness. It had been the road, waiting for its keeper to remember. She put the mask on. It fit perfectly. No adjusting. No awkward edge. It sealed to her face like it had been made for her bones. The world changed, not visually, not like magic light or swirling snow, but the hollow's pressure eased. The corridor widened a fraction. The mountain's hum softened as if a hand had been lifted from a throat. Elena inhaled. The air tasted clearer. The snow did not restart. Instead, the sky of the hollow brightened slightly, as if clouds had moved away. The stars looked sharper. The road straightened. Not a literal road, she understood it as a sensation. The mountain's confusion, its shifting paths, its hungry rearranging, those things settled. Like a restless animal finally lying down. The man exhaled, and it sounded like the first true breath he'd taken in years. He rose slowly from his kneel, joints stiff, face drawn. He looked at Elena, at the mask on her face, and his eyes shone with something like grief. "I'm sorry," he said. Elena didn't know what to say. The mask muffled her breath, turned her own voice into a quieter version of itself. The man stepped backward toward the corridor. "It will be quieter now," he said, almost pleading, "as long as you keep it." Elena's mind spun, trying to grasp the scale of what had happened. Responsibility settling onto her shoulders like a heavy coat. The idea of staying here, in this shifting forest, holding a hungry road closed. She wanted to scream. But the mask did something to her panic. It smoothed it, pressed it down. Made her fear feel distant, as if it belonged to someone else. The man paused at the corridor's mouth and looked back one last time. "Don't forget," he said, "that it listens." Then he turned and walked away. Not running, not chasing, leaving. Elena watched him go until rocks swallowed him, until the corridor looked empty and harmless again. And then she stood alone in the hollow, wearing a mask that fit like destiny, feeling taller, not in body, but in presence. The mountain around her exhaled. The hunt ended. Another began. Part 5. What followed her home. When Elena finally stepped out of the mountain's hollow, she did not remember walking. She remembered the pressure easing. She remembered the air tasting clean. She remembered the hum in the ground settling like an animal laying its head down. After that, time became a thin thread she followed without seeing. She found herself on asphalt. Morning light lay pale across a familiar two-lane road, as if the night had never happened. The snow was gone. The forest looked ordinary, dense, indifferent, harmless in daylight. Her car sat at the shoulder, clean and intact, like a photograph restored after being burned at the edges. The keys were in the ignition. The engine started on the first try. Elena sat behind the wheel, hands still, listening to the quiet purr as if it were a lie told too smoothly. Her headlamp lay on the passenger seat. Her backpack was on the floor, heavier than before. She looked down and saw the mask inside it, wrapped in the thermal blanket like something fragile. She did not remember taking it off, but she was grateful, in a hollow, detached way, that it was not on her face anymore. She could not have driven with it. She could not have looked at her own reflection. She pulled onto the road and drove. The GPS blinked once, then displayed a calm blue line. Briar Glen, Blackridge Pass, Valley Road. No detour, no fork. When she reached the town, her phone regained signal all at once and lit up with messages. Her sister calling, then texting, then calling again. A voicemail from an unknown number. Another from her boss. Another from her sister. Elena answered none of them until she had parked in a grocery store lot and sat with her hands on the steering wheel long enough for her breathing to become normal. Only then did she call her sister. "Where are you?" Her sister's voice burst out, raw with fear. "Elena, oh my God, I've been calling all night. The police." "I'm okay," Elena said softly. There was a pause, a half-sob swallowed. "You're not okay. Your car, someone found tire marks near the pass. You weren't there. They searched. They said the weather." Her sister's voice broke. "They said it didn't make sense." "It didn't," Elena replied. She meant it in every possible way. That afternoon, the search team came anyway, because official systems didn't accept mysteries. They needed paperwork. They needed reasons. They needed a story that could be filed and forgotten. 2 deputies drove Elena up toward where she insisted the fork had been. A volunteer rescue coordinator followed in a truck full of ropes and cold weather gear. They asked her questions as they drove. How much had she had to drink? Had she been tired? Had she taken any medication? Elena answered with short truths that did not satisfy them. "It was here," she said when they reached the bend that had once led to the split. The deputies exchanged a look. "There's no fork," one of them said gently, like speaking to someone grieving. Elena stepped out of the vehicle. The air smelled like pine and dust. No iron, no smoke, just the ordinary world. She walked the shoulder. She stood where the detour should have begun. She looked at the trees, the slope, the empty space. Nothing. Not even a scar in the earth. The rescue coordinator crouched and touched the ground with gloved fingers. "No tire tracks," he murmured. "Not even old ones." The older deputy tapped his clipboard. "You sure about the location, ma'am?" Elena stared at the forest until her vision blurred. Somewhere deep inside her, something that was not quite thought pressed against her ribs like a hand. "It is closed," it seemed to whisper. She swallowed, then nodded once. "I was wrong," she said softly. The deputy's shoulders relaxed. The coordinator sighed with relief. They wanted her to be wrong. Wrong was safe. On the drive back, Elena watched the GPS screen on the deputy's console. It showed a clean, simple route. Nothing unusual, nothing missing. But once, only once, the blue line flickered. For half a second, a faint gray shape appeared beside it, like a ghost road trying to remember itself. Then it vanished. Elena returned to her sister's house that night. Her sister hugged her too hard, trembling. The baby slept in the next room, making those small, wet newborn sounds that felt like the definition of life continuing. Everyone spoke loudly in the kitchen, as if volume could keep fear away. They made Elena tea. They offered soup. They tried to fill her with warmth and routine, with normal. Elena accepted politely. She smiled at the right moments, but her voice stayed quiet, not timid, controlled. She had learned something in the mountain. Loudness was not only sound. Loudness was presence. Loudness was emotion spilling outward. In the days that followed, Elena's family began to notice changes that were hard to name. She closed doors gently, always, even when no one else was sleeping. She walked without stomping, even in heavy boots. She spoke softly, even when she was angry. Her anger did not flare, it sharpened. At night, she did not sleep deeply. She lay still, listening, her eyes half open as if waiting for a sound to confirm reality. Her sister joked once, trying to make it lighter. "You've turned into a spy." Elena smiled, and the smile looked like a habit rather than joy. "I just hear things now," Elena said. It was true. She could hear the refrigerator's low hum from across the house. She could hear the baby's breathing shift in the next room. She could hear the subtle rasp of her sister's sweater sleeve as her sister moved her arm. And sometimes, rarely, she heard something else. A slow inhale, a slow exhale, not inside her house exactly. More like behind it, more like behind her. Elena began to learn who carried the scent of the road. It wasn't literal, though sometimes there was a faint metallic tang near certain people, as if their blood ran too close to the surface. Mostly, it was something in how they moved. A restlessness, a distracted drifting of attention. They looked at maps too long. They turned their heads toward side roads with a hunger they didn't understand. Elena saw it first in a man at a coffee shop. Mid-30s, tired eyes, hands that trembled slightly as he stirred sugar into his drink. He kept glancing toward the window, toward the street beyond, like he expected something to arrive. When he stood to leave, Elena noticed his wrist, a watch with scratches on the face. The hands were frozen at 10:41. Her stomach clenched. She knew then that the mountain's influence didn't end at the tree line. It leaked into lives, into objects, into time itself. And when Elena walked past him, the man's phone in his hand suddenly beeped and recalculated his route. He frowned at the screen, confused. Elena did not stop. She did not look back. But she felt the air shift subtly, like a path being rearranged in her wake. Maps rearranged themselves around her, she realized with a cold, slow dread. It happened repeatedly after that. Her own GPS glitched at odd moments, even in the middle of town. A line would appear where no road existed. Her phone compass would spin for no reason. Once, while driving through a familiar neighborhood, she saw a street sign that read Black Ridge. Then blinked and saw it was a normal name again. When she told herself she had imagined it, she felt the mountain's quiet amusement somewhere deep in her bones. At night, the mountain whispered. Not in words, in sensations. She dreamed of footsteps in snow. She dreamed of her own breath being too loud. She dreamed of watching someone run through trees, not as herself, but through borrowed eyes. And always in those dreams, there came a moment when the footsteps stopped behind her bed. She would wake with her body frozen, her heart beating carefully, her ears straining, and she would hear nothing. Yet she would feel a tension lingering in the corner of her room, like the shadow of the role she had accepted. The hunter never truly leaves, she understood, because the hunter was not only a man, it was a function, a duty, a shape cut into the world, waiting to be filled. A month after the incident, Elena drove alone at night for the first time. She stopped at a gas station on the edge of town, the kind with buzzing fluorescent lights and a tired cashier who didn't look up. The air smelled of fuel and old coffee. Trucks hissed in the distance. Elena stepped inside to pay, keeping her movements small, quiet. A young woman stood by the counter, clutching a map brochure in trembling hands. She looked about 20. Her eyes were bright with nervous excitement, the kind that comes from a decision made impulsively. "I'm looking for the pass," the young woman said to the cashier. "Black Ridge. It's supposed to be scenic, right? But my phone keeps changing, like it can't decide where it is." The cashier shrugged. "Never heard of it." The young woman laughed too loudly, trying to convince herself the fear was silly. "It's weird. I swear it was on my map earlier." Elena froze a few feet behind her. She saw it immediately, the drifting attention, the subtle hunger, the way the young woman's gaze kept flicking toward the dark road outside as if something out there was calling her by name. Elena felt the pull in her own chest respond, like a hook tugged gently. She understood then that the road was not simply closed, it was balanced, and balance required maintenance. Elena stepped forward, her voice soft enough that the young woman leaned closer to hear. "Don't go looking for it," Elena said. The young woman blinked, startled. "What?" Elena met her eyes, kept her own face calm, still, quiet. "Some roads aren't lost," Elena continued. "They're selective." She paused, choosing words that wouldn't sound insane, words that might still land. "If your phone keeps changing, take that as an answer. Go somewhere else." The young woman frowned, confusion and irritation fighting on her face. "That's dramatic." Elena didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She simply said, "Please." Something in Elena's tone, something old and patient, made the young woman's expression soften. She hesitated, then looked down at her map brochure as if it had betrayed her. "Okay," she muttered. "Yeah, whatever. I'll just go home." Elena watched her leave, watched her walk quickly to her car, watched her drive away without looking back. Only then did Elena allow herself to exhale. She had warned one person. Just once. It wasn't kindness. It wasn't heroism. It was maintenance. The road needs balance. Too many survivors would create instability. Too many people half touched by the mountain, carrying the pull, carrying the scent. The system would strain. The road would start opening without control. The forest would lean closer to more lives. Elena understood that now in the same way she understood gravity. Not morally, but physically. And understanding did not make it easier. Weeks passed. Elena tried to return to ordinary life. She visited her sister. She answered emails. She attended meetings where people spoke loudly and asked for projections and forecasts and certainty. She nodded at the right times. But she began to sense the pull returning. It came in small ways at first. A tug in her chest when she drove near wooded hills, a sudden tightening behind her eyes when she heard the scrape of something heavy dragged across pavement. Then it came in her dreams, more insistent, less symbolic. Footsteps, snow, a road forming beneath her feet, and the hum beneath it all, steady, patient, expectant. Elena began to pack without deciding to. A backpack, a headlamp, bandages, knife, the thermal blanket, folded neatly, waiting, and the mask, wrapped and hidden at the bottom as if it might hear her thoughts and respond. She told herself she was being cautious, prepared. But on the third night of packing and unpacking, she stopped and stared at the open bag. Because she realized she wasn't preparing for a trip, she was preparing for a return. The pull returns, she thought. It always does. On a cold evening in late autumn, Elena drove aimlessly outside town, trying to exhaust the restlessness. The sky was clear. The road was empty. Her GPS behaved normally, until it didn't. A faint gray line appeared on her screen, branching off the main highway. It wasn't labeled. It wasn't highlighted like a suggested route. It looked tentative, like a whisper in map form. Elena's hands tightened on the steering wheel. She knew she could ignore it. Drive straight. Go home, pretend she hadn't seen. But the moment she tried to commit to that, the gray line brightened slightly, as if encouraged. Her heart beat once, hard. She whispered, almost without meaning to, "Not now." The GPS flickered. The gray line dimmed. Elena swallowed. She could feel it. The mountain's attention shifting toward her through distance, through data, through the quiet channels of the world. The road remembers its keeper. Not with affection, with need. Elena drove home that night with the radio off, listening to the car's engine, to the tires on asphalt, to her own breath. When she climbed into bed, she lay still, eyes open, waiting. She did not dream of footsteps behind her bed. She dreamed of a map, blank, empty, until one thin line appeared, slowly, confidently, like a pen drawing itself. And somewhere far away, in a place that did not exist unless it was being watched, a mountain road quietly formed again. Just for her.